Good evening, everybody. Welcome to class number 4 of the Book of Lost Tales Part 2. Tonight, we are going to finish the Turin Turambar story, the first iteration of the Turin Turambar story. And so I'm, well, I was about to say I'm looking forward to that, but it's really kind of hard to look forward to the end of the Turin Turambar story. We were discussing last week about how differently this story kind of hits us. It definitely hits me differently than the later version does. But I'm not sure that the ending of this version isn't more horrible, really, than the later one. But yeah, Tom says it never really ends. It's kind of like the spell of bottomless dread. Yeah, I kind of like that. But first, let us first touch on happier things. That is a quick announcement, and the announcement is that we are soon approaching the release of our Mythgard summer courses for this year. And which I am very excited about. I'm going to be teaching a class again this term, but I want to start off with the brand new class that, well, actually both of these classes are new that we haven't offered before, and Brandon Young has guessed it. Our first class is Dr. Amy Sturgis teaching a full semester class on the work of H.P. Lovecraft. This is a course that many people in the Mythgard program have been begging for a while, and Dr. Sturgis has heard you. She's extremely excited to do this class. So I know Lovecraft is somebody who has had an impact, perhaps not as broad as Tolkien's, but in some ways I think as deep. I know that the work of Lovecraft has really really hits people and has really meant a lot to a lot of people. And I agree, Brandon, he probably is the greatest horror writer of all time, I think. Anyway, I'm perfectly willing to go along with that statement. But anyway, so this is going to be a really great opportunity. If you've never really had the opportunity to delve into the Lovecraftian world before, this will be a great experience, a great opportunity to do it not only under the expert guidance and wonderful tutelage of Dr. Sturgis, but also with plenty of moral support from others, so that you're not all alone and scared while you're reading. This should be a really great class. I'm also teaching a class, as I mentioned, and this is going to be a brand new class I've never offered before, but a course that I have really wanted to do for a long time. And the course is going to be called Tolkien's Poetry. I'm just going to be studying Tolkien's poetry from one end of the semester to the next. I'm going to look at his entire career corpus of short poems. We're not going to get a chance to study the long poems, things like The Fall of Arthur and Sigurd and Gudrun and things like that. But all of his shorter works, okay, there are probably one or two I'm going to leave out, but I'm going to try to hit absolutely as many as I really can. And yes, Brandon, including the poems in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings as well. I did a bunch of poetry when I did the Beyond Middle-earth class now 2 summers ago in the summer of 2012. Or was it 2013? It was 2013. And that was cool, but it still felt really rushed. I only had a couple weeks to do that, and to me, it was just kind of like the taste that I have not been able to. That I didn't find satisfying enough. I always love talking about Tolkien's poetry, and this semester I am fixing to indulge myself. And the main thing I think about Tolkien's poetry, we're going to be looking at, as I said, about his whole work, from early fragments that we have, from when Tolkien was a teenager, all the way up through the final revisions of poems he was doing in the 60s. We're going to sort of finish around the Adventures of Tom Bombadil collection in the mid 60s. and look at the whole scope along the way. And if you want to get an understanding, if you want to be able to contextualize Tolkien's work in the process of his thought, right? I know that, we're doing Book of Lost Tales Part 2, right? But I know that the Middle-earth, the history of Middle-earth series as a whole is really daunting for a lot of people. It's fantastic background. It's really fascinating to see how Tolkien's thoughts and ideas are growing over time. But I know that, especially the reiteration of the different versions of the Silmarillion stories can be really hard to keep straight. And of course, many people have a hard enough time with just the published Silmarillion to kind of go back over multiple, often quite confusing and incomplete earlier versions of the Silmarillion story is often a little more than a lot of people want to do. But I think that this class would be a marvelous way to get a really good sense of basically how Tolkien's literary career went, where he started from, how his, the sort of the directions in which his thought developed, how the Middle-earth stuff and, how the Middle-earth stories grew out of his other thinking, and how those all came together and where they led, and how they came together with these other things that he was thinking of, and the way that we can sort of see Tolkien, like Nigel in his story Leaf by Nigel, sort of tacking on these, his other pictures around the edges of his great picture. It's very cool. Now, are we doing the Ways of Beleriand? No, not doing the Ways of Beleriand. Again, short poems. We're not going to do the alliterative Children of Hurin. We're not going to do the Lay of Lathian. If we want to do the Ways of Beleriand as a Mythgard Academy course, I'm totally cool with that. But I'm not going to. We're just doing short poetry in the course. And again, one of my primary goals there is to be able to give this kind of an overview, so that we really can go, from like the 19 teens all the way forward to the 1960s. Really look at 50 years of Tolkien's life in poems, which he was writing continuously all the way through there. It's going to be really cool. So anyway, so that's the plan. Those are our lit classes. There are also maybe upcoming soon some additional forthcoming announcements about other courses that may be available, perhaps language courses, but I will hold off on those for now. But those are going to be our literature classes for this coming summer, and they're going to be awesome. So the registration for those classes will open within the next week or so, hopefully somewhere around then. Soon, very soon. Anyway, so I want to let you guys know that that's what's coming up. Now, we must steel ourselves and go back and look at the end of Turin's story. Where I want to start is shockingly where I left off last time, but I want to kind of take a second to contextualize that a little bit. We were just looking at the fall of the Rodolphim. I always screw up that name. Anyway, the fall of the people who will later on be the people of Nargothrond. With the attack of the dragon, and we were looking at Turin's choice to come back, and the way we get Turin making the sort of comparatively positive choice to go back and fight to the death, and die while heaping a body of corpses before the door of Felivrin's father's house. It's not like that's a happy ending, but the opportunity to sell your life dearly while trying to protect, the elf maiden Felivrin to the death. Like I think we can probably all agree that it's a way better outcome than Turin actually gets. And again, so to me, it's really fascinating that he's given that option, right? You'll remember the later Turin. Everything is. He comes back to Nargothrond in the later version, only to find Glaurung already there, and everything already wrecked. So it's not that he gets a chance to turn the tide. It's not that he gets a chance to save the city or something like that. But he does get a chance to accomplish some good thing. Like Faramir says of Boromir, right? In fact, he could die almost exactly like Boromir, actually. But he is not quite given that chance. And this leads to the moment where we see Turin, that is this Turin in this story, making what I think is the biggest choice he makes in the entire story. This is the moment that I think is, I would argue that this is the real turning point. There are obviously lots of really important moments in Turin's life, his departure from his separation from his mom, obviously the bit of aggravated manslaughter that we got back in the caves of Artenor, the death of Beleg. Obviously, those are really important things, but we haven't really seen him making a choice in the same sense in which we see him choosing in the later versions. Let me try to illustrate what I mean by this. Remember the later Turin, right? And by the later Turin, by the way, I just want to clarify the reason I keep saying the later Turin instead of just referring to the Silmarillion. By the later Turin, I am embracing both the longer Narn Ihin Hurin thing that we get in Unfinished Tales, the one that we read before last year and talked about then, and that's really sort of the definitive later Turin Turambar story. The story that's in the Silmarillion was compressed from that. That's the source of the Silmarillion version, and Christopher Tolkien deliberately chose to give a shorter version. Of course, as you probably know, it's still the longest chapter in the Silmarillion, but anyway, that's why he compressed it, because he didn't want it to completely overwhelm the entire rest of the book. And it's from the sort of a slightly developed version of the Narn that we get the separate Children of Hurin. That's why he came back, I believe, Christopher came back and published the Children of Hurin later on, because he wanted to give the full version of the story. And again, if you remember, those of you who took the Unfinished Tales class, the version in Unfinished Tales isn't quite complete, because the Silmarillion version was already out there, so there are bits where he's like, and in this section, and then, we're going to skip over a whole bit because it's pretty much the same here as it was in the Silmarillion. So prior to the publication of the Children of Hurin, there wasn't any one place in which you could read, cover to cover, the entire story, of the later, the latest development of the Turin Turambar story. That's what the published Children of Hurin was. So, okay. So that's why I keep saying the later Turin, because I'm referring to that Silmarillion, Narn, Children of Hurin version of the story. Now, when we think about that version, about that later version, remember the very significant big choices that he makes, and the way in which the narrator emphasizes how important that choice is, and how sort of comparatively independent was Turin's, just like sort of how forceful was his deciding in that moment. Two which jump out to me really prominently. Again, I'm thinking here especially from this part of the story that is from his confrontation with Glaurung back. His decision not to go back to Doriath, right? Which he makes and remakes like 3 times. He doesn't go back with Mablung. He doesn't go back when Beleg finds him the first time. He won't go back when Beleg comes in and stays with him the second time. So there's that's one, right? And that's a huge decision in the sense of, you think of how much of Turin's life, how much of Turin's misfortunes that come after hang on that choice. Had he gone back to Doriath, things would have been fine. He should have gone back to... There were lots of reasons for him to have gone back to Doriath, right? But he didn't. But he refused to do it. So the kind of stubbornness which led Turin to stay out of Doriath plays a huge role, and therefore has a big impact not only on like the shape of his career, but on our perception of him. Right? The Beleg's role there, in sort of coming back and saying, please, please, please come back with me, and, him saying, no, 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 that's what really emphasizes for us how significant and repeated is Turin's choice. The second choice is with Nargothrond and the bridge over the River Narog, and basically the way in which Turin is the champion for the foolhardy policy which ends up exposing them to the dragon. Now, you might say, well, hang on a second, Turin does that in the old version too. How is it different? Well, I think it's pretty significantly different in a couple different ways. For one thing, we don't have the clear indicators that the concealment of that people is the right thing to do, right? In the later version, we get very clear, we get that scene where Finrod and Turgon are both given the vision from Ulmo, telling them that they should find a place of refuge where they can hide, and that therefore, there might be a stronghold of the Eldar which Morgoth won't be able to find. So the whole concept of the beginning of Nargothrond is this, divinely appointed quest to establish a secret stronghold. So let's not reveal the secret stronghold that Ulmo told us we should conceal. Seems like the pretty obvious move, right? And to diverge from that strategy seems like a pretty obviously bad move. Saying no thanks, Ulmo, we're good, right? We don't need to do what you told us to do. We're going to do our own thing instead. In the older story, in the Book of Lost Tales version, it is not at all that clear, I think, in any way. Their choice to be, they seem to just have a kind of a general preference for remaining hidden, and it's not obvious that that's the right thing to do. It might be the more practical thing to do, but it's not necessarily clear that it's the right thing to do. Remember, we're told that there are many of the Rodolphim who rally behind Turin's suggestion that they fight more openly because they want to defend these lands and not just concede them to the orcs as they're coming through. And, I'm not sure that that's a bad thing. We have the building of the bridge by Turin in the later versions, right? Again, this bridge which is made explicitly within the story into a symbol of this openness, right? Of this defiance, of this broadcasting of who they are, and their sort of open defiance of Morgoth and his power. And we don't get that, right? Just a general, they weren't as secret as they were before. And nowhere in there do we get this idea. Turin comes this close to open usurpation of Orodreth's throne in the later version, right? I mean, he is so masterful that people begin to listen to him and don't even pay much attention to Orodreth anymore. He doesn't officially take the crown for himself, but it's in the ballpark of that, right? Again, we clearly don't see the same kind of dynamic. Again, he urges them to do this, and many people agree with him. So you can say, well, it's still his fault that they made that choice, and that therefore they were open to the dragon. I just think it's very different. I think the dynamics of that are very different, and it is, so it's pretty easy to say the fall of Gondolin, or no, not Gondolin. That's actually one thing we can't blame on Turin. The fall of Nargothrond is pretty much Turin's fault. I mean, he makes the call, and it happens because of him. You can make that argument in the older text, but it's not really that clear, both because he's not commanding, he's suggesting, and anyway, it's not so obviously transgressive. The transgressive nature of that change in policy, that change in strategy for those people, is made very explicit in the later versions by those messengers from Ulmo who come to remind us, right? Who come to say, okay, people, it's time to go, right? Abandon, you're all going to die. Cast that bridge into the river and go and, it's just, this is awful. Ulmo comes and says, and Turin speaks out against them and defies them, right? We just received messengers from Ulmo, but ignore them, right? And that, again, seems like a really obviously bad thing to do. So once again, we have later Turin making a doggedly, pig-headedly bad decision repeatedly, under these repeated hints, suggestions, strong suggestions, commands that he do something else, right? We don't get that from the early Turin. We don't see that same, so it's, whereas those two decisions spotlights are really shown on those decisions by how of the later Turin, by how many times he repeats them, by the number of indicators that he gets that he really shouldn't do this thing that he's insisting on doing. Really emphasizes how much he is indeed insisting on doing them. We don't get that. I mean, I think we could make an argument that the early Turin doesn't really decide in either case. I mean, he chooses to leave Artenor, but he never even gets the opportunity to come back. He's never invited back, right? And there's nothing of that same air of stubbornness, right? I am Nathan the wronged, right? So I'm going to go. No, I shan't return. I'm not going to go back. We don't ever get that from this Turin. And again, in his time with Rodolphum, I don't think we see anything like that same, like, I am doing this thing, this is my choices, my determination, I'm going to be the champion of this disastrous thing. I mean, yeah, it turns out not to be good, but I don't think that, yeah, Michael is reminding us, of course, that even Gondolin and Nargothrond were destined to fall, and that they should love not too much the work of their own hands. Exactly, but of course that counsel by Omo is exactly what he's rejecting when the messengers come, and that's most emphatic in the Narn/Children of Húrin version of the story. Yeah, good. And Nick, I agree. Nick Marazzo says in this version, the place which is not yet Nargothrond seems like more of a temporary, transient settlement, almost a hideout. Yeah, I agree. It's like the fall of it is not as big a deal. I mean, it's not that it's not any kind of deal, but it's not like, and the mighty Nargothrond has fallen. I agree. The whole thing is lower key, so the increased magnitude of the event, of the fall of Nargothrond, is something which, again, I think really just emphasizes the significance of Turin's guilt. And guilt, I think, is an important word. Notice Turin himself feels guilty in the early version, right? It's guilt that leads him not to return to Artenor in the first place, right? Because he feels that there's blood on his hands, and he is guilty of the blood of Orgloff, or whatever the heck Cyros's name is not, is in the I don't know why I have a mental block on that name too. Orgoff, is it? Anyway, so he feels like he's got blood, or at least wine, on his hands. And then, of course, he kills Beleg, and he's definitely not going back after he kills Beleg again because he's ashamed. Even though neither one of those things was exactly his fault, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens to the old Turin, right? Yes, he gets mad. Yes, he throws a drinking cup at the guy's face, but he wasn't trying to kill him. But then the guy dies. Oh, man, like, okay. And then, of course, the horrible, terrible killing up of Beleg, which is obviously even more accidental and terrible. So like the bad, and even this, like the advice that he gives, it's not horrible advice. It's very understandable, and many people are sympathetic to it. It turns out, things don't work out very well, but it's not exactly on him. And again, this is where I come back to what in my mind is really significant. The making of the sword by the Rodolphim for him. He asks them for a sword, and they forge him this really quite morally shady sword that they give him, and that sword that they have given him gives him is where he gets his name, right? And again, it's just the dynamics there are almost reversed from where we see them later on, where he is the dominant one who already has his sketchy black sword, right, which is reforged for him indeed in Nargothrond, but he already has it, and he is identified by it. But again, it's his sword and him going out in the front that leads to, whereas again here they give him the sword, they give him the nickname. It's the role that he finds there. But rather than this being yet another example of Turin choosing badly, in the old version, it's yet another example of something good for Turin going bad. That's the pattern that we have, not bull-headed, stubborn, and usually wrong Turin acting and insisting, as we get in the later version. Instead, we get poor Turin, poor, sad, and unhappy Turin, who keeps having everything good in his life wrecked. He had found joy. It was limited joy, and touched always with the something more than touched. Shot through thoroughly with the grief and mourning of his separation from Mavwin and his concern about his mother and sister back in Dorlomen, and yet it was still, he found some joy there, and he was accepted, and he was friends with Beleg, and he was the adopted son of the king. But then he loses it, right? And off he has to go. Then he finds some transitory happiness with Beleg and the rest of his band of merry men, right? Until they're ambushed by and slaughtered by the orcs. And then, of course, you've got the terrible killing of Beleg. And then he's brought back, and he recovers from his grief to some extent among the Rodolphlim, and he helps them. And they are fighting together, and he finds a fair sister with all of the just skin-crawlingly crushing, horrible irony of that. I mean, I can't even read that line where it's like, and he had found a fair sister in Philivrin, and it's like, oh, the irony, just like, I mean, it's so awful. But he's found happiness a little bit, a version of happiness again, right? In another place where he is welcomed and admired and loved and has people who care about him, and then he loses it all again, right? That's the pattern that we keep getting here. Mark Ingram was asking me if I would say that this Turin's bad choices add up to a whole Turin on my Turin scale. See, I would never have invented the Turin scale of bad decision-making if this were the only Turin we ever had, right? Because this is a story that is fundamentally, I think, not about Turin's choices. It's about what happens to him. This Turin is just simply more unfortunate than the other Turin. Not in the sense of merely being unlucky, right? Though we're told that explicitly earlier on, but just like the terrible things that happen to him, they're not independent of his actions, right? It's not like everything that happens to him is a pure accident, which has nothing to do with his own will, with his own volition, but the way in which they're tied to his actions just make them more horribly unfortunate, like the manslaughter of Orgoff in the Elven King's halls, in Tinwelland's halls. He did it, but the actual death is just a misfortune, and it's too awful. Tom was asking if do I think that the sketchiness of the sword suggests that those who forged it were sketchy too in some way? Tom, it's hard to avoid that conclusion, and it's one of the things. Notice what happens, Tom, in the later versions, right? The later Turin's sketchy sword, which Beleg has originally, is indeed forged by a sketchy person, right? It's the product of Eol, the Dark Elf. And, right away, they're, Thingol and Melian are like, whoa, some of the sketchy spirit of the smith is in this sword. Like, be careful with this sucker because, there's sketchiness afoot in this sword, right? We don't get anything like that in this earlier version. And I don't know if it's because Tolkien himself, too, was thinking the sword was kind of sketchy and didn't want that sketchiness associated with the Rodolphum or the later people in Nargothrond, so he shifted that off. I don't know if that was his motivation. But Tom, in the context of this story, it's hard to resist, in my mind, the idea that the sketchiness and aggression of the sword is, related at least to those who made it. And that's why, it's one of the reasons why, to me, though it seems like a small deal, the fact that they forged him his sword instead of him bringing it in, to me has a pretty big impact. And it's why it really affects my reading of this portion of the story entirely, because that the fact that they forged him this bloodthirsty, super malicious sword suggests, at the very least, a much greater buy-in to the let's be aggressive and open in battle plan than we got than we get in the later version, and possibly sort of an indication that that again they didn't take all that much convincing, and it's not really on the shoulders of Turin so much. Kay says this seems to be Turin the hapless rather than Turin the reckless, maybe. Yeah. That seems to me right. I mean, the hapless is a word that I have been thinking about a lot, actually, while reading this version. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Tom. No, that was it was a different Tom. Tom Hewitt was the one who was saying about this raising the issue of the sketchiness of the forging, not Tom Hillman. Sorry, I want to make sure give proper credit there. Good. Okay. All right. Yeah, and Nancy's pointing out that Turin definitely did act unjustly in being violent to he who is not Cyros, even if he didn't intend his death. And you're right, Nancy, that's exactly what kind of makes it so horrible, right? Is that he is guilty. Not guilty of intent. I mean, what happened was far beyond his intention, and he didn't mean that, and it was... But he did do it, right? He is guilty. He caused the guy's death, and although he's... he's let off on the murder charge, but still, to me, that doesn't lessen the sense of misfortune, but increases the sense of misfortune, because he has actual and undeniable guilt, even though his intentions weren't awful. And that's worse. I mean, of course, the Beleg slaying is just the absolute worst example of that, right? I mean, he killed Beleg, right? He did it, and knows that he did it, and carries that grief with him too, and the self-loathing. But it kind of, in this other sense, it wasn't his fault. Yeah, good. Tom Hillman says all occasions conspire against him. That's I think exactly right. But all of this was lead up to the choice, the real choice that he actually makes, right? His first big decision. I think his first big decision in this story, and that is what he does in response to Gloran's words. Then was Turambar aflame with sorrow and with shame. This is the Gloran has just told him about his mom and sister and how awful it was that he hasn't been back there and everything, all that stuff. With sorrow and with shame, for the lies of the worm for the lies of that worm were barbed with truth, and for the spell of his eyes he believed all that was said. Therefore, his old desire to see once more Mavwin, his mother, and to look upon Nianori, whom he had never seen since his first days, grew hot within him. And with a heart torn with sorrow for the fate of Failivren, he turned his feet towards the hills, seeking Dorlomen, and his sword was sheathed. And truly it is said, forsake not for anything thy friends, nor believe those who counsel thee to do so. For of his abandoning of Failivren in danger that he himself could see, came the very direst evil upon him and all he loved. And indeed his heart was confounded and wavered, and he left those places in uttermost shame and weariness. Notice the even-handedness of the judgment of the narrator. And first of all, notice the fact that the narrator is making a judgment here. Right, a very explicit judgment. In fact, the narrator is interrupting the story in order to do commentary on the story, right? And truly it is said, forsake not for anything thy friends, nor believe those who... Right, there's like the take-home message, right? We are in no doubt about how we're supposed to be interpreting what just happened, right? Turin was wrong to do this. But, at the same time, this is not mere condemnation, right? This is not the narrator being like, and once again, Turin has screwed everything up, right? That's not what we get here at all. Notice that it begins and ends with engaging our sympathy on Turin's behalf, right? His emotions are being manipulated, like not just like by somebody who's talking to him and bringing up things that make him upset, but like he's under a spell here, right? For the spell of his eyes, for the spell of the worm's eyes, he believed all that was said. So part of his decision is influenced by the fact that he believes Gloran's words because of the power of Gloran's will, because of an actual enchantment that is placed upon him through the eyes of the worm. And notice the nature of the enchantment, right? Notice the consequences of the worm's influence over him, and that is his desire being inflamed, growing hot within him to see his mother and his sister again. And of course, we remember the context of this. This was his first sorrow, his separation from his mother, and his better than a decade-long anxiety over them, and what has happened with them. That is I'm just saying over a decade, just while he was in Artenor. But that is what's being inflamed, right? So this thing which we know was like one of the greatest, prior to the whole killing of Beleg incident, the thing which was the greatest sorrow in his entire life is being the thing that's being stirred up and being used against him. And that desire to find and protect his mother and sister, and his sense of shame in not having done that, in having left that undone. Remember why didn't he when he was leaving the King's Hall anyway, right? Felt like he was banished. You'd think, well, he could at least have gone back, and if he's going to leave anyway, why didn't he go back and look for Mavwin then? Do you remember why? Remember why? Anybody? Pop quiz from last week. James, yes. Shame. He was ashamed to go back and face his mother because he was afraid that she would know that he had been cast out as an outlaw, right? You sent me to be raised by the king, and he accepted me with grace, and I repaid that favor by murdering one of his counselors and being cast out like a criminal into the streets. And yes, Jewel, also fear that the elves would take it out on her too. That they were, at that point he believed that that he was on the lam, right? That the law was coming after him and might pursue him, and that his family might be in danger if he went to them. Now, of course, that's not at all true, but nevertheless, he feared that. But you see how that plays in here, right? He had the chance before to go back and secure the safety, or at least check on the safety of his wife, his mom and sister. And why didn't he do it? Because he was ashamed of himself, right? And so now, how much, doubly, he's feeling this longing and this shame, right? That I didn't do it when I had a chance, and the only reason that I didn't was that I was feeling because of my own pride, because I was feeling sorry for myself. And how pitiful must that look now in retrospect, as he's being presented in this light with the fact that he's been neglecting his mother and sister. The way that Glorund is playing on him is masterful. And by the way, although Glaurung is scarier than Glorund, Glorund is 3 times as clever and devious. Glaurung is stronger, and therefore kind of scarier. But man, Glorund is a piece of work. I mean, the incredible shrewdness and heartlessness of Glorund's deceptions, and the sort of the complexity of the web of lies that he weaves over both Turin and over Mavwin and Nianori is really, I think it's unmatched. I actually really prefer the dialogue of Glorund to that of Glaurung. just for the sheer wittiness. Christopher Tolkien says that he thinks that by his by by cutting back on the speech of the dragon in later versions, he makes him very much more intimidating, which is like, I think, maybe kind of true, but I don't know. I think I really like Glorund myself. Yeah, Patrick Summer says Glorund just exudes pure malice, not merely strength and power. I agree, and he's so obviously smart. I mean, it's the incredible intelligence and cunning. I mean, we're told that Glaurung is cunning, but Glaurung, I mean, he's not half as cunning as Glorund was. It's amazing. Much more of a schemer, I agree, Lauren. Anyway, okay. But going back to this, because I said at the beginning and the end, in between, surrounding this clear condemnation of his action, right? We get first what I consider a very sympathetic introduction to it, right? Showing how understandable it is that he would make this, and also how much he is under the influence of the dragon, and how exactly the dragon is playing on him, and then the business that we get at the end. And indeed, his heart was confounded and wavered, and he left those places in uttermost shame and weariness. I think... someone was asking, Karita was asking, is he ashamed because of abandoning Philevrin, or because he feels like he has abandoned his mom and sister? Both, I think. In the context, I think it's pointing especially to Philevrin. Again, just going back up to the beginning of that sentence, and truly it is said, forsake not for anything thy friends, nor believe those who counsel thee to do so. For of his abandoning of Philevrin in danger that he himself could see, came the very direst evil upon him and all he loved. And indeed his heart was confounded and wavered, and he left those places in uttermost shame and weariness. The context of that sentence, to me, makes it pretty clear that this is not... He's forgotten about Philevrin, and he's just like feeling incredibly ashamed about his mom and sister. I do think he's feeling shame about his mother and sister. That seems to be one of the things in the top part that's really driving him. But his shame at the end, I think we're seeing the division of his own heart, right? The thing that the narrator is saying, that's part of the tragedy, right? Is that that's not like news to Turin exactly. He sees Philevrin right there in direst evil. And remember also the fact that in this version, unlike the later versions, Turin has just had that brief change of heart, right? There's nothing that, I guess if absence makes the heart grow fonder, a horde of orcs about to burn the house down around you makes the heart grow even more fonder, apparently. Even more, even fonder, even faster. Because there was that moment when Turin had that one, where he believed that he could love Philevrin, right? That just broke through, right? And think of what that breaking through means, right? I mean, again, going back to that horrible, skin-crawling irony of him really liking Philevrin, right, and being like, "You're like a sister to me. You who should be my wife are like a sister to me," in obvious and dreadful anticipation of what is to come. But again, we see. I mean, it's right. It's pretty obvious, right? The whole shape of the story shows the tragedy of Turin is he's got his sister and his wife backwards, right? In other words, in that moment when he turns to Philevrin and thinks that he could love her, as the orcs are about to drag him to the ground, that's the moment when it almost went right? It's like Turin's story was that close to a happy ending, and the narrator even suggests that here, right? Of his abandoning of Philevrin in danger that he himself could see, came the very direst evil upon him and all he loved. It's pretty clear what this story views as the direst evil that happens, and that is the tragic incestuous relationship between himself and his sister. The narrator does seem to me to suggest there, had he stuck with Fylivrin, had he tried to rescue Fylivrin, the horrible things wouldn't have happened. Now, he probably would have died, but that wouldn't have been a horrible thing. Again, like dying while the orcs sack the house around you is a good death, right? We're sort of back into Boromir territory now. If that's the way that he goes. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, okay, so again, it's very interesting to me that in this moment where we see him making a choice, and it is emphasized as a choice and emphasized as the wrong choice, yet still we're given all of these promptings to view him sympathetically and to see this as not recklessness, Faye, as you suggested, but haplessness, right? Look at what comes of this. Two more passages I want to follow this one up with. This is when he gets back up to Dorloman. This is another passage that I think is just fascinating to compare, to sort of contrast with the later Turin. This is when he's gotten back to Dorloman and said, said that he's looking, he's talking to people and saying he's looking for his mom and sister, and they can't believe that anybody made it across the borders, right? Then Turambar was in perplexity at this, and he doubted the deceit of the dragon's words. Yet he went now in hope to the dwelling of men and the house of his mother, and coming upon homesteads of men, he was easily directed thither. Now men looked strangely at his questioning, and indeed they had reason. Yet were such as he spoke to, in great awe and wonder at him, and shrank back from speech with him. For his garb was of the wild woods, and his hair was long, and his face haggard and drawn, as with unquenchable sorrows. And therein burnt fiercely his dark eyes beneath his dark brows. A collar of fine gold he wore, and his mighty sword was at his side, and men marvelled much at him. And did any dare to question him, he named himself Turambar, son of the weary forest. And that seemed but the more strange to them. What's emphasized about him? One thing that I think is fascinating about this moment is that in the... no, Arthur, that's not Tevildo's lost collar. Tevildo hasn't lost his collar yet. But anyway, we get that description of him at this moment, right? What do we see? What do we see in this description? What is emphasized here about Turin? When the people of Dorloman look at him, what do they see? What does this passage tell us that they see? Good, yeah, James. That's the very simplest thing, right? That we have to sort of reconcile. His wild looks and the contrast with his clothing, James says. On the one hand, he looks like a vagabond from the wilderness, right? His garb was of the wild woods, and I don't think this means like I'm dressed like Robin Hood, right? But rather means like I'm dressed in rags, like a wanderer who doesn't have access to any clothing, right? So he's dressed in rags, and his hair is long, and the dude whose name is not Cyros would be, I'm sure, simply appalled at his coiffure, right? And his face is haggard and drawn, and his eyes burn fiercely. But, as James points out, we have the contrast, right? He's got this gold collar and this mighty sword at his side, both of which, and I don't think, by the way, the mighty sword at his side is like a little bit scary, but even more, I think in the context of that sentence, I think the primary emphasis is that it's a sign of wealth. remember that in older cultures like this, like in old Anglo-Saxon or Old Norse culture, your sword is the heirloom that's passed down from father to son. If you have a great and mighty sword, that's a sign of stature, probably of good family. That it's wealth. I mean, if you've got a really good sword, that's a really. It says a great deal about you. If you have a mighty sword. So so the gold collar and the mighty sword both say the same thing. Like, whoa, on the one hand, those two things, if I met somebody else who was wearing a gold collar and a sword like that, I would guess, he was probably a king or something. And so it doesn't fit with the rags. This, by the way, is one of the really quite silly things about a lot of medieval films, but Peter Jackson's films do this all the time. Like in the Lord of the Rings films, when the Rohirrim are all coming together and like handing out swords, they're always doing that. Like, it's the sword distribution center, right? It's not how, an Anglo-Saxon-esque culture would be handling swords. Like they don't have them, and like the king has, hundreds of them to give away. It's kind of ridiculous. Yes, Tolkien uses the word weapon take, but that's not what you take your weapons to it. You don't go there in order to have weapons distributed to you. Take your weapon and get over here is what it means. But anyway, so the point is, they don't know what to do with this guy, right? And they don't know how to understand him. And then he says who he is, right? My name is Master of Doom, son of the Weary Forest. And that seemed but the more strange to them. Yeah, I bet it did. Sarah asks, why don't they assume he is a robber? A really good question, right? I mean, there is a way in which, like, a vagabond from the woods might have a gold collar and a really nice sword, and that's if he looted it off the corpse of a rich guy that he killed, right? Conceivably, but yet they don't seem to respond to him that way. They don't seem to classify him as dangerous vagabond, but rather, and I don't know, that there seems to be, again, sort of something about him. What we have is men marveling much at him. I don't think that means that they're not afraid of him. I mean, men marveled much at him, and did any dare to question him, suggesting that many of them did not indeed dare to question him. So there's clearly some intimidation, but again, it's not like, rumors that he's a highwayman are following him, right? Because there seems to be something else about him. That is one category in which both his rags and his riches would simultaneously fit. Well, probably a highwayman would steal the nice clothes that rich man probably had also. But anyway, whatever. Maybe he's a crazy highwayman. But nevertheless, there's something, notice also how that description with his face is haggard and drawn as with unquenchable sorrows. Remember also the cultural context, right? The sort of political context of the people of Dor-lómin, right? They're a conquered people who are living in what Melko has made basically into a very large ghetto into which the men are being cooped. And that's why they're kind of shocked when he's like, yeah, I came from outside and I'm wondering if anybody left. And they're like, dude, what the heck are you talking about? We can't leave. So that is to say, although you're right, Sarah, that robber or highwayman or, whatever is one interpretation that would fit a guy who has both rags and riches. They're a conquered people, right? And so when you are being oppressed, people who are on, somebody who is on the run is not necessarily, might possibly be on your side. And it seems that his haggard and drawn as with unquenchable sorrow's face seems to perhaps influence them to some extent as well. Anyway, okay. So, but here the thing I noticed his name. here, right? And notice the significance. We've already talked about how late Turin names himself all the time, right? He's already, by this time in his life, late Turin has already given himself like 5 different names. The Turin in this story only gives himself one name, Turambar, right? He takes that name on purpose. But we were looking last time at the contrast between how he takes that name for himself in this story versus later on. Later on it's an act of defiance, right? I have won, I have conquered fate, and so I shall call myself Turambar. And in the earlier version, where he names himself Turambar as basically an indication of his choice to die, right? Where he's going to escape his fate in the only way that he knows how, by attempting to compel Glorin to kill himself, or to kill him. Attempting to get Glorin to kill himself would be a pretty neat trick, but yeah. So he's basically trying to die in order to escape his fate. So even that is not nearly. It's a sign of despair, not arrogance. Here, it's possible to look at this passage and say, well, now that old Turin now that early Turin, I should say, now that early Turin is getting the hang of naming himself, he's really taken off with it, right? Now this is the second name he's given himself in like 4 pages, but I don't think so, right? Son of the Weary Forest. This is not. It's not really about him exactly. Son of the Weary Forest is just more like a description of where he came. Again, you think of the names that later Turin gives himself, and they're all about him, right? He's describing himself. I am Nathan the Wronged. I am Agarwine, son of Umarth, right? I know he doesn't name himself the elf man, but the Mormagil. These are all names which are like this, and then he names himself Wild Man of the Woods, right? He names himself Woodwoes. When he names himself Turambar, right? These are all things where he's fundamentally saying, like, this is me. Like, I am describing the most important thing about myself. That's not what Turambar is doing here. This is not what early Turin does, right? He's like, son of the weary forest, meaning I'm a wanderer. I have no home, right? Remember the shame that he's feeling, the despair that he's feeling, the desolation that he is the guy who has lost everything again and again and again, and now he's just the son of the weary forest. In this sense, this is not about him, right? He's much less focused on himself. He thinks less of himself than the later Turin thinks. And that, again, is another thing which really has a pretty strong influence, I know, on my own reaction to him when reading this story. Another interesting moment, following up on that choice that he made, is Iron's judgment when he kills Broda. But she, hearing the tale, said, Nay, grieve not for me, son of Urin, but for thyself. For my lord was a hard lord, and cruel and unjust, and men might say somewhat in thy defence. Yet behold, thou hast slain him now at his board, being his guest. And Orlin thou hast slain, who is of thy mother's kin. And what shall be thy doom? At those words some were silent, and many shouted, Death! But Iron said that it was not wholly in accord with the laws of that place. For, said she, Broda was slain wrongfully, yet just was the wrath of the slayer. And Orlin too did he slay in defence, though it were in the hall of a feast. Yet now I fear that this man must get him swiftly from among us, nor ever set foot upon these lands again, else shall any man slay him. But those lands and goods that were Urin's shall Broda's kin hold, save only do Mavwin and Nianori return ever from their wandering. Yet even so may Turin son of Urin inherit nor part nor parcel of them ever. Now this doom seemed just to all save Turambar, and they marvelled at the equity of Iron, whose lord lay slain, and they guessed not at the horror of her life aforetime with that man. But Turambar cast his sword upon the floor, and bade them slay him. Yet they would not, for the words of Iron whom they loved, and Iron suffered it not for the love of Mavwin, hoping yet to join those twain, mother and son, in happiness. And her doom she had made to satisfy men's anger and save Turin from death. Okay. Now, on the one hand, I too marvel at the equity of Irene in her judgment here. This is an immensely fair and even-handed judgment. Notice how she is, on the one hand, recognizing what Turin did was really wrong. And by the way, now following up on the really bad decision that he did make in leaving Philevrin and coming up here, this has led to his now committing his first genuinely wicked act. This is the first really bad thing. I mean, okay, yeah, like, he killed a guy. He killed the dude whose name is not Cyros. But that was an accident, right? He attacked him. He didn't mean to kill. I mean, we've been over that. This is different from that, right? I mean, he stands up and murders this guy in his own hall. And as Irene points out, and is a huge deal, he doesn't just kill him on purpose, meaning full well to kill him. He kills him at his own board as host, right? He's welcomed Turin in, and he has given him food at his board, and Turin rises up and kills him in his own hall. That's really bad. But at the same time, Brada, his wrath, that is Turin's wrath against Brada, was just. Brada had done him a wrong. And Irene is willing to say, we can understand why he did this. I'm going to punish him, but not with death, because his wrath was just. Did Brada, was the killing of Brada a bad thing? Yes. Did Brada deserve what he got? Yes, he probably did. And Irene is like, don't even get me started on how much this loser deserved what he got, right? But nevertheless, you guys don't even know how much this guy deserved it. So she's, was the killing, was the wrath of Turin justified? Yes. Was his action acceptable? It was absolutely not acceptable. It was a very wrong thing to do. It was a terrible thing to do. But since there was cause, there was a very understandable cause for his wrath, he's still going to be punished. We're going to banish him, right? And then what she does with the property, I mean, this is brilliant, right? Urin's property is going to be given to the kin of Brada, right? Why? Weregild, right? Remember, some are drawing their swords and wanting to kill Turin right there. Well, hey, we're gonna pay a Weregild to the family of Brada, in giving them rightful claim now to Urin's wealth, to what little wealth Urin had left, or Mavwin was still holding. But if Mavrin and Nianori come back, the kinsmen of Brada have to give it back up to her. And they can't complain that the Weregild is being taken away because it was wrongfully seized from Mavwin in the first place. And so therefore it is only a just restitution of the crime, for the crime that Brada himself had made. So again, she's like, you kinsmen of Brada can't be complaining that justice wasn't done for you for the death of your kinsman Brada, because you're being paid a Weregild. And if that Weregild gets taken away later on, you have no ground on which to stand, because that money was unlawfully taken by Brada in the first place, and it is a just sentence against him and his kin that money, that they should not be allowed to keep that. But Turin is not going to be able to inherit any of it under any circumstances, right? Lest the killers of Brada then say, oh sure, let's give the Weregild for our dead kinsman back to his murderer. We're not having that, right? So no, none of it goes to the murderer. I mean, it is an amazingly I think that the cunning of this. Nancy Fosberg says that Irene is maybe the most admirable person in this story. Nancy, I think I might disagree, or I might not disagree. I she is awesome. I love Iron in this story, but again, notice how we're getting a very similar thing, sort of from Iron here. This is a moment of judgment. I mean, she's literally sitting in judgment on Turin at this point, right? So again, it seems a really interesting moment to look at for the sake of getting some cues. How is this story prompting us to judge Turin, right? Clearly, we should be able to get some kind of a sense, some kind of an indication of how we're supposed to be looking at Turin from how he's judged here. And how is he judged here? Very even-handedly, right? He is, what he has done wrong is being plainly acknowledged, but what has provoked him to it is given sympathy, right? There are consequences. We recognize consequences for what he does, and he has brought many of these negative consequences on himself through his own action. But yet mercy is shown to him, and ultimately his own best interest is being sought, as Iron is desires in the end to make him happy. Sarah King asks a great question. How does she have the authority to do this? Does she get to choose because she's Broda's wife and therefore a prominent person, or because she's the injured party? Both, Sarah, but I think especially the latter. She obviously has the respect of the people, or they would just tell her to shut up and wouldn't listen to her at all. But nevertheless, she clearly has, in a sense, if not political authority, at the very least moral high ground, because she is the primarily injured party. But she is also sort of sitting in the place of Broda. Broda is the one who is ruling thereabouts, and his widow now is laying down the law, and they respect it, right? They respect what she says. So that's I think pretty cool, actually. Okay, so again we get this really even-handed response to Turin, both sort of condemnation and also sympathy. Let's turn now and look at Mavwin and Nianori. I'm not sure how to characterize the difference between Mavwin and Morwen, and between Nianori and Nianor. Both of them strike me as... Mavwin is still proud, but she seems less... less haughty, less dignified than Morwen. Less sort of on her own dignity. Nianor, or Nianori, is more... She's very headstrong in the later version, and strong-willed, but seems to me even more willful and independent than the Nianor of the later story. Notice the difference between the way in which the trip out to go visit the dragon is initiated in these two versions, right? Morwen in the later version just basically says, I'm going to go and find out what happened to my son. Y'all can come with me if you want, right? But I'm going to go do this, and Thingol is like, let's send her an escort and try to keep her safe and maybe even convince her not to do this. Mavwin basically manipulates Tynwelint into thinking this is a good idea, right? Into basically going on his own to go fight the dragon. And that's a much more significant accomplishment. And Nianor, the later Nianor, is sort of stubborn in going along with them. Nianori shows even more feistiness, I think, and she I love the way in which she actually successfully defies the dragon, and at least briefly breaks his enchantment. She momentarily overcomes his will. We hear in the later story that Nienor struggled against the will of the dragon, but in the end she wasn't able to do anything. Glorin still wins in his battle of wills with Nienori in the earlier version, but she does a little better, and that seems to me interesting, and therefore the more tragic that it's her words that lead Glorin to have his terrible, awful idea of what to do to her. That's an interesting way to say it. Nick Marazzo says the Mavwin in this story is less grim than Morwin in the later version. That seems to me exactly right, Nick. She's more sorrowful, but less grim. I'll buy that distinction. One of my favorite passages of the new story, of the older version, the early version of the story. Right after Nienori is taken by the dragon's enchantment, we get this sort of Nienori's point of view description as she runs through the woods. Now, on a time in an opening in the wood, she descried a campment, as it were of men, and creeping nigh by reason of hunger to espy it, she saw that they were creatures of a squat and unlovely stature that dwelt there. And most evil faces had they, and their voices and their laughter was as the clash of stone and metal. Armed they were with curved swords and bows of horn, and she was possessed with fear as she looked upon them, although she knew not that they were orcs, for never had she seen those evil ones before. Now did she turn and flee, but was espied, and one let fly a shaft at her, that quivered suddenly in a tree beside her as she ran, and others, seeing that it was a woman young and fair, gave chase, whooping and calling hideously. Now Nienori ran as best she might for the density of the wood, but soon was she spent, and capture and dread thraldom was very near, when one came clashing through the woods, as though in answer to her lamentable cries. Wild and black was his hair, yet streaked with grey, and his face was pale, and marked as with deep sorrows of the past, and in his hand he bare a great sword, whereof all but the very edge was black. I love this description. First of all, by the way, this is one of the very few descriptions of orcs that we get, like, ever. Tolkien describes orcs shockingly seldom, actually, but in the Silmarillion, almost never. So this is and certainly one of the very earliest descriptions. We've heard about orcs, but we've never really seen them. So it's a fascinating passage, even if only for that reason, But there are two things that she sees, right, which we get described to us as if we too didn't know them, didn't know what they were. The orcs and Turin, right? And they're not exactly the same, but again, we're invited to see them as she sees them, not understanding what either one of them are. Nick says if the text didn't name them orcs, they may have been confused with dwarves. Yeah, Nick, when I was, I remember reading this for the first time and thinking they were dwarves, especially because they use the word unlovely, right? Creatures of a squat and unlovely stature. Unlovely is the word that's used, of course, in the published Silmarillion to describe the Naugrim, the dwarves, when they first emerge and are met by the elves in the Silmarillion. Like squat and unlovely, I was like, oh, she met dwarves. That's kind of random, right? No, actually, they're orcs. Orcs and dwarves are not unlike one another. Keep in mind two things. First off, the history, the background says dwarves are generally evil. That is the Norse background, which is the place where we seem to be living here primarily in the Book of Lost Tales. Dwarves are bad guys, almost universally. the sense of like the good dwarves, the noble dwarves, who are maybe misunderstood by the elves, is a later thing. In fact, it's one of the most remarkable shifts in Tolkien's entire literary career. The appearance of the good dwarves, the not wicked dwarves, in Bilbo Baggins's parlor. You know, when that happens in like around 1930, they come out of the blue. The dwarves had always been explicitly categorized with orcs and other servants of Melko in these early stories. Jana was just pointing this out too. The idea that the dwarves would be orc-like and primarily evil in the early stories, that's not the shock. I mean, it's sort of a shock from the perspective of later Tolkien writings, and for people who only know the Lord of the Rings and are thinking about Gimli all the time. But it's the good dwarves that are a shock as far as a departure from kind of folklore tradition in that way. Let's see. B. Scrivener. Is it Brandon? I'm trying to remember your first name. But anyway, Mr. Scrivener says, is it the first appearance in literature of good dwarves? No. No. There had been good dwarves before. I mean, let's forget that at almost exactly the same time The Hobbit was being released, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was also being released by Walt Disney. So friendly dwarves were in the air at that point, which actually Tolkien strongly disliked. Nancy, they were always within months of each other. It was a big deal. And I've told this story before, but just try to picture to yourself. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien went to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs together. I would have loved to sit with C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien watching Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in the theater. But anyway, yeah. Anyway, so okay. And I don't know, Karina, did they throw popcorn? No idea. But neither one of them were big Disney fans in general, so I don't think I doubt they neither of them really liked it. But anyway, yes, Nick, I think that it was one of the reasons that he was sort of especially grumpy about Disney, because it's not just that the stories came out at the same time, but Walt Disney from the very beginning was really, really good at merchandising. The whole, like, being flooded with, promotional merchandise and knickknacks and things related to a film, it's not a modern phenomenon. Disney did that. And Tolkien commented upon, like, the fact that when The Hobbit was being released, like, America and Europe alike were just, like, awash in tacky little, Doc and Dopey the dwarf figurines and things, which his daughter Priscilla kind of liked. And I think that, so it was kind of especially frustrating, that here he was trying to tell this story about, Thorin Oakenshield and company, and, like, the whole world is awash in these Disney dwarves. So anyway, that's material for a different lecture. But just a little context on dwarves. But that's a digression from her description of orcs, which are not in fact dwarves, but just look like them. So anyway, moving on. Let's go back to. One more thing about the dwarves. Jana says it's fair to remember that Disney didn't write the original story; it already existed. And what Tolkien disliked was what he considered the rape of the story. Yeah, absolutely. And there are lots of dwarves in fairy tales. I mean, you read the Brothers Grimm, and you'll find lots of dwarves, but most of them are. You would be unwise to trust a dwarf who came up to you and told you something. Usually they're not. Usually a dwarf who comes up to you in a fairy tale and tells you to do something does not have your best interest at heart. It's not a universal law, but you would be better advised to keep your eyes open and feel for your hatchet, as Mr. Beaver would say in Narnia. But anyway, back to Nianori here. Okay, so here she is, and she sees the orcs, and we see them too, as if for the first time. She sees them not even understanding what they are. She's approaching stealthily, hoping to find food somehow, and instead she finds danger. And then this guy who comes as if in response to her lamentable cry, as though in answer to her lamentable cries, comes clashing through the woods, and he seems really great, right? Although we see again in the second physical description that we get of him those same marks of sorrow. Arthur, that is a fascinating study, isn't it? Arthur is suggesting contrasting this meeting to that between Beren and Tenuvio. It is. I think there are lots of things that we could say about that. That would be a really neat kind of study, actually, because we get these two very significant meetings in the woods. Anyway, her name, and again, what I want to focus on here. Look at the sort of cues that we as readers receive here. How are we supposed to be feeling about this? What is this story? How is this story working on us? Then sat Nianori upon a stone, and for weariness and the lessened strain of fear, sobs shook her, and she could not speak. But her rescuer stood beside her a while, and marvelled at her fairness, and that she wandered thus lonely in the woods. And at length he said, O sweet maiden of the woods, whence comest thou, and what may be thy name? Nay, these things I know not, said she, yet methinks I stray very far from my home and folk, and many very evil things have fallen upon me in what way, whereof naught but a cloud hangs upon my memory. Have fallen upon me in that way, whereof naught but a cloud hangs upon my memory. Nay, whence I am or whither I go I know not. And she wept afresh. But that man spake, saying, Then behold, I will call thee Niniel, for little one of tears. And thereat she raised her face towards his, and it was very sweet, though marred with weeping. And she said with a look of wonderment, Nay, not Niniel, not Niniel. Yet more might she not remember, and her face filled with distress, so that she cried, Nay, who art thou, warrior of the woods? Why troublest thou me? Turambar am I called, said he, and no home nor kindred have I, nor any past to think on, but I wander for ever. And again at that name, that maiden's wonder stirred. Okay, what do we see here? What does the story emphasize? And here, this is a moment where I actively want to forget the later version. I want to really just focus in here. There are similarities and differences we can point out. Christopher Tolkien is great at pointing out the similarities and the differences. He doesn't do much with those, though. I keep sort of wishing he would do more than just point out the similarities and differences. Those we can notice for ourselves. But what do you think is interesting about those? But anyway, let's look at this here. What do we see here? Good. James is pointing out how neither of them have any past. Yes, good. Notice the parallel between the two of them, right? Many very evil things have fallen upon me in that way, whereof naught but a cloud hangs upon my memory. Turin himself could speak almost exactly those same words, right? It's not that he doesn't remember them, but the idea, many evil things have fallen upon him, and a cloud hangs upon, the time behind him, his memory of the time behind him. That you could definitely say that of Turin. So yes, the parallels between them are definitely interesting. Good. James points out that they're both called by names that are not their own, and Turin is the author of both of them. Turin is the one who has given both of those names. Yes, I agree. I agree, Sarah. It is interesting that she can speak in this version. She's not simply inarticulate. And notice what she says, right? When he says, I will call thee Niniel, or little one of tears, she says, nay, not Ninio, not Ninio. How do we take that? How do we take that? What does that mean? It works in a couple different ways, right? Yes, Nancy, it does sound almost like she realizes that this isn't her own name, right? Yes. Yes. Good. And Bartleby, okay. That was close. Bartleby says that she doesn't want to be thought of that way. Yes. She doesn't identify with that name. Brandon says, yes. But why not? This is, to me, the most painful thing here, right? On the one hand, I don't want to accuse Nianori of being flirtatious here. That seems inappropriate, especially since she's all full of distress and crying and stuff. But there's that sense of, but I'm not the one of tears, right? I've been rescued. And there's that first sort of recognition of, it's the thing which is, I think, explicitly articulated in the thing which is being explicitly articulated in the later version of the story, that she felt like one who had found something that she had sought, but she didn't know what it was, right? That is to say, simultaneously, her saying, not Nino, seems to point in two different directions. On the one hand, her near recognition of the name, saying, no, that's not quite it, right? It's like my name, but it's not the right name. I'm not Nino, but it's also, no, I'm not the one of tears, right? I'm the one who maybe has found joy, right? And it's awful for us to read this, and we know what's going on, and we can see the way that both of the that it goes. Even again, her own words: "Who art thou, warrior of the woods? Why troublest thou me?" Right? Why are you taking trouble over me? Why are you? Why are you? But also, like, why? There's something about you that troubles me. And he names himself Turambar. And no home nor kindred have I, nor any past to think on, but I wander forever. Yeah, just like her, right? And again at that name, that maiden's wonder stirred. Why troublest thou me? I am troubled by you. Seems to be part of it, and I don't know why I'm troubled by you. But she is in wonder at him, and again the two-pronged nature of her wonder I find extremely painful. Yana says, one wonders if Turin had said, I am Turin, son of Urin, she might not have remembered something. I agree, Yana. Even the mere fact that she has no speech at all in the later version suggests to me that, like, the power of Glaurung over her is more absolute than Glorun's is over Nianori in this version. I too wonder that, Yana. And so again we see his changing of his name to Turambar leads to perhaps the sort of the perpetuation, at least, of this tragic misunderstanding. But it's not even that's simply a punishment for him for taking this new name, right? Remember, the circumstances under which he took this new name was in despair, right? Seeking death. And as a result, now it's it's awful. But it gets so much more painful. Now as the days passed, Turambar grew to love Nino very greatly indeed, and all the folk beside loved her for her great loveliness and sweetness. Yet was she ever half sorrowful, and often distraught of mind, as one that seeks for something mislaid, that soon she must discover. So that folk said, would that the Valar would lift this spell that lies upon Nino. Twist. They have some sense that is, now they mean that metaphorically, right? That there's something wrong with her. There's some. It's like there's a spell on her, right? Oh, if only somebody would lift that. Nonetheless, for the most part, she was happy indeed among the folk and in the house of Bethos, and each day she grew ever fairer, and Tamar Lamefoot, who was held of little account, loved her, though in vain. Now came days when life was once more seemed to contain joy to Turambar. Oh no, that's a terrible sign. And the bitterness of the past grew dim and far away, almost like this cloud of forgetfulness is over it. And a fresh love was in his heart. He to who had such a hard time winning love, remember? Then did he think to put his fate forever from him, and live out his life there in the woodland homes with children about him. And looking upon Nino, he desired to wed her. Turambar, who took his name in a fey mood, seeking death, right, has now decided, wait a second, maybe there's hope, right? Maybe I can cling to life instead of death. Maybe I can escape my fate and live, right? And like that instead of seeking death, which he still has almost been doing, it seems. Even just the fact that we get him like running on his own through the woods with his sword after the orcs, one on however many there were in that camp, suggests he still hasn't entirely stopped seeking death, right? But now he's going to seek life, right? Children rather than suicide. And looking upon Nino, he desired to win her. Then did he often press his suit with her. Yet though he was a man of valiance and renown, she delayed him, saying nor yea nor no. Yet herself she knew not why, for it seemed to her heart that she loved him deeply, fearing for him were he away, and knowing happiness when he was nigh. I don't know why I want to say no to him, 'cause I know that I love him. And even, again, notice how the whole thing is littered with things which should be clues even to them, right? And again, it's, to me, the worst thing about the incest of Turin and Nianori is that, once again, it's like the manslaughter of the dude who isn't Cyros in Artenor, right? On the one hand, it's not his fault. But on the other hand, he did it, right? With the incest, there are lots of clues that they have that something is not right. Lots of reasons that they might be suspicious, maybe. Who would suspect it, right? The chances of him meeting his own sister that he's either never met or hasn't seen since she was a baby. Remember, Tolkien seems to be kind of uncertain about kind of waffling on that point as he's writing the story. Hasn't really decided about whether that, which one of those things it should be. Yeah, exactly. Stephanie says, it's as if they both continually recognize the familial connection they have to one another, but cannot fully realize it. Absolutely, Stephanie. Stephanie, you notice the horrible echo, like the grief that he had in his childhood of separation with his family, and now he experiences joy, right? Joy and love and life, because he's reunited with his family. But he doesn't. So the moment when he has finally achieved the hope that he has held since he was a little boy, that he would one day be reunited with his family, has come to pass. And when it comes to pass, it's the most awful, horrible thing that has ever happened to him. It's just awful. Yeah. Yeah. Yana says, I know the incest is horrible, but in a way their love seems very true, which in a way makes it worse. But love in itself isn't inherently bad. Exactly. Exactly, Yana. It's both, right? I mean, neither one of them are doing a wicked thing here, right? And it is lovely, and it's very sweet, but the more awful for that reason. I mean, Sarah, thinking back to what Sarah King was saying before, that it's, their meeting is really sweet, and their the relationship is sort of, charming, but it's, so close, and yet no. Yeah. Yeah, Karita asks, don't they look alike or something? Yeah, I'm sure it's one of those things that in retrospect, it's really obvious. But also don't forget, Turin's face has really changed, right? He's got that, shrunken, haunted look, and the graying hair. Even the graying hair, right, would probably deceive her into thinking that he's older than he is, right? So she wouldn't, even if she remembered that she had a brother who was, 12 years older than she, or no, not even... He's, what is he, 5 years old, either 7 or 5 years older, because isn't he 7 when he leaves Torloman? Am I remembering that right? And she's either 2 or 0 when he leaves, again, depending on which way it falls out, whether he's ever met her. But yeah, 7, right. So, but he's got gray hair, right? He looks much older, much more than 7 years older than she is. So even if she did remember that, and I go to Sarah points out, they don't have the same hair color, it seems. So there's some evidence that they don't look alike, that he takes after their mother and she takes after their father. But anyway, let's keep pouring on the pain. Seeing, therefore, the love of their new chief for Ninio, and thinking they knew that she loved him also in return, those men began to say how they would lief see their lord wed, and that it was folly to delay for no good cause. But this word came to the ears of Ninio, and at length she consented to be the wife of Turambar, and all were fain thereat. And imagine how much they regretted that later on. A goodly feast was made, and there was song and mirth, and Ninio became lady of the woodland rangers, and dwelt thereafter in Turambar's house. There great was their happiness, though there lay at times a chill foreboding upon Ninio's heart, but Turambar was in joy, and said in his heart, "'Twas well that I did name myself Turambar. For lo, I have overcome the doom of evil that was woven about my feet." Again, notice how much less arrogant he is than the later Turin, right? He's just like, hooray! Look at me! I'm living happily ever after. Wow! I never thought it would happen to me. I've overcome the doom. Right? It was well that I named myself Turambar because I'm living the dream here, right? Oh, just painful. The past he laid aside, and to Ninio he spoke not over much of bygone things, save of his father and mother and the sister he had not seen. But always was Ninio troubled at such talk, and he knew not why. But again, all of these hints and things that are just going to seem intolerably painful in retrospect. But of his flight from the halls of Tinwellant and the death of Beleg, and of his seeking back to Hisalome, he said never a word. And the thought of Philivrin lay locked in his deepest heart, well nigh forgotten. Naught ever might Ninio tell him of her days before, and did he ask her, distress was written on her face, as though he troubled the surface of dark dreams, and he grieved at times thereat, but it weighed not much upon him. Even that. Maybe, gosh, in retrospect, I really should have pushed maybe a little bit harder on those dark dreams and what was beneath the surface, and maybe should have taken a little bit more seriously her being troubled when I talk about mom and sister, and the later story is awful and depressing, but I don't think there is anything in the later story to rival the terrible, dramatic, just the crushing, soul-destroying, dramatic irony of these passages in this early version, because we have more sympathy for Turin, because he's a much nicer guy who just has just has it bad, just gets dealt like a really, really horrible hand, just, wow. Then let's look at jumping ahead here to their deaths. We're starting to run out of time. I want to get to the... but I'm determined to get through their suicides, and what's more, address more broadly the suicide issue. By the suicide issue, what I mean is, there are a lot of people who read the story and are like, whoa, like, seriously? Like, the stories end with suicide? Like, isn't that kind of not okay? I mean, I thought Tolkien was a Catholic. Like, is he actually, like, heroizing suicide here? That doesn't seem to me. Would he do that? That doesn't seem to make any sense. A lot of people have a hard time kind of putting those two things together. And I want to address that generally. And what's more, as you will have noticed, the story itself addresses that. The early version of this story, this version, addresses it very much more directly than the later versions do. And I think that's that's really interesting, and we'll definitely get to that. Arthur Harrow says, he's quoting me, "Let's jump ahead to their deaths. Is there any more succinct comment on the story of Turin?" Yeah, there's always so much crushing dramatic irony I can get through before I just have to leap forward to the suicide as a kind of relief from the rest of the story. That is a kind of a commentary. I agree on the story. Anyway, okay. Here's Nianori. There did she stay her feet. And remember, this is over the silver bowl where she had had a terrible misgiving before, but she wasn't quite sure why, right? And standing spake as to herself, O waters of the forest, whither do ye go? Wilt thou take Nianori, daughter of Urin, child of woe? O ye white foams, would that ye might lave me clean, but deep, deep must be the waters that would wash my memory of this nameless curse. O bear me hence, far, far away. Where are the waters of the unremembering sea? O waters of the forest, whither do ye go? Then ceasing suddenly, she cast herself over the fall's brink, and perished where it foams about the rocks below. But at that moment the sun rose above the trees, and light fell upon the waters, and the waters roared unheeding above the death of Nianori. Yes, Karita, I too was thinking, I shall be lady of the stream. I too was thinking of Silverweed. Arthur also, yes, it does sound like she's quoting Silverweed, but she's not. Sorry, Watership Down reference for those of you who didn't do the Watership Down class with us. This does sound very much like the lyrics of one of the poems in Watership Down. But anyway, bygones. Okay, what's she saying? What's she saying to the waters? What do we hear in her final words? What is the final state of Nianori as she comes to... Well, first, she heaps upon us a little bit more bitter twisting of the dramatic irony, right? Her naming of herself, right? Wilt thou take Nianori, daughter of Urin, child of woe. She declares her true name, Nianori. And then you notice what she adds? But really, a better name for me would be Maiden of Tears. That's really what my name would be. No, she's like, yes, Niniel. Yes, Niniel. Oh, awful. And then, like, that deep, deep must be the waters that would wash my memory of this nameless curse. Oh, for amnesia right now, right? Like, oh, man. But she wants to be cleansed, Brandon, yes. Would that ye might lave me clean, right? She wants to be cleansed, which of course shows that she believes that she's been soiled, right? There's no sense of like, well, I mean, we didn't know, right? I mean, God, it's under the circumstances, you can't really blame us, no harm, no foul. I mean, this is not Leonore's perspective, right? She feels that she needs to be cleansed. She feels that she clearly feels that she has done something horrible, even if unintentioned, and she wants to be washed clean, but she is concerned that the white foams of the forest stream are not going to be enough to wipe her clean, that only the waters of the unremembering sea might have the... But notice, even there, she's saying, I'm not going to be able to be redeemed. I'm not going to be able to be cleansed. The best I can hope for is forgetfulness, is the unremembering sea. And that final question, O waters of the forest, whither do ye go? Do you go to the unremembering sea? Will you take me to the unremembering sea? I don't know. But on the chance that you do, Michael says the waters don't answer. Yeah. Now Lauren Falkenberg makes a wonderful observation. She's pointing to the fact that when she jumps, and perished where it foams about the rocks below. But at that moment the sun arose above the trees, and light fell upon the waters, and the waters roared unheeding above the death of Leonore. And Lauren says there's definitely ambiguity from the narrator there, if not outright approval, in the business of like the sun rising at the moment that she fell upon the waters. I agree with you, Lauren, in the sense that we don't get the sense of condemnation, right? I think we are, if we're responding in horror at what has happened to her, that seems entirely justified and just what the story has been prompting us to do. Does this story ask us to reel back in horror at the mere fact of the suicide, right? They're like, oh, she committed suicide. That's a terrible thing to do. I don't see that prompting here. So Lauren, to that extent, I do think I agree with you. Now let's look at Turin's death. So did he leave the folk behind, and drive heedless through the woods, calling ever the name of, kind of like he was on the day he met, calling ever the name of Niniel, till the woods rang most dismally with that word, and his going led him by circuitous ways ever to the glade of Silver Bowl, and none had dared to follow him. There shone the sun of afternoon, and lo, were all the trees grown sere, although it was high summer still, and noise there was as of dying autumn in the leaves. Withered were all the flowers in the grass, and the voice of the falling water was sadder than tears for the death of the white maiden Leonore, daughter of Urin, that there had been. There stood Turambar, spent at last, and there he drew his sword. And so, well, first of all, let me pause before we get to the sword. Turin's experience of the falls there. We get here some more, perhaps, commentary, right? On the one hand, we have the terrible symbolism of the withering of the leaves, right? The trees growing sere, meaning dry and withered. And noise there was as of dying autumn in the leaves. There's this sense of grief. There's this sense of desolation coming about him. Notice the sort of the implication. The connection that he makes between the waterfalls and the tears, right? Sadder than tears for the death of the white maiden Leonore. So the linking, we got the white foam of the river and the white maiden Leonore, right? And the tears and Niniel. So there's this like near identification of the two things. If this were a Greek myth, Leonore might simply have turned into a waterfall, right? Had been transformed. She was the maiden of tears, and then she is transformed into a waterfall, and therefore is crying forever. That would be like a very Greek myth ending of that, right? Tolkien doesn't do that, but symbolically we almost get that, right? She is associated with this waterfall. The Silver Bowl has become not just sort of the place of her death, but the place which almost illustrates her death. Yes, Tom. Of course, I was thinking Niobe, exactly, Yes, Karita, like trees in November. That's exactly what they look like. Anyway, okay. Then, Turambar and his sword. There stood Turambar, spent at last, and there he drew his sword, and said, Hail, Gortholfin, wand of death, for thou art all men's bane, and all men's lives fain wouldst thou drink, knowing no lord or faith, save the hand that wields thee, if it be strong. Thee only I have now. Slay me therefore, and be swift, for life is a curse, and all my days are creeping foul, and all my deeds are vile, and all I love is dead. And Gortholfin said, That will I gladly do, for blood is blood, and perchance thine is not less sweet than many a one's thou hast given me ere now. And Turambar cast himself then upon the point of Gortholfin, and the dark blade took his life. First, how sketchy is that sword? I mean, the sword is deeply creepy, right? Karita points out that it is not merely sketchy; it is evil. Yes. Sarah says it's a sword. The sword is a connoisseur of blood. Ew. Yes. Yeah. The sword simply desires blood, right? I mean, and that perchance thine is not less sweet than many a one's thou hast given me ere now. I'll probably enjoy your blood as much as I've enjoyed the blood of everybody else I've killed, right? Bring it on. It almost leaves us with this terrible, terrible image that the only one who ends this story happily ever after is Turin's sword, right? We have every horrible waste and desolation except for the sword, which is like, that was great, right? I love this story, right? I mean, it's just terrible. Turin's words, right? This is the culmination of all of the misfortune of his entire life. Life is a curse, and all my days are creeping foul. Remember what later Turin says to his sword, right? Later Turin says, Will you slay me also? And the sword speaks like a judge, not like a bloodthirsty monster, right? The sword is upset for its former master Beleg, for Brondir slain unjustly, right? And it basically sentences and executes Turin for his crimes, for his sins. Not here, right? We don't get that emphasis on his sins, just on the creeping foul horror that his life has been and is, and which is now crashing in on him. All my deeds are vile, and all I love is dead. Just the horrible, horrible despair. Yeah. Exactly. Nick Marazzo was just thinking the same thing about the difference between the justice which Gurthang later is dealing out to Turin, whereas Gortholfin is just having fun because it's who he is. It's what he does. Now, okay, so back to the larger suicide question. How are we supposed to feel about this? Is this a big deal? Are we, if we are worried about it, or if we're thinking that it's a big deal, is that just because we are kind of imposing this? We know that Tolkien's Catholic, and we know that according to Christianity, suicide is a big deal. So we're imposing a concern about suicide on this. If we didn't know that Tolkien was a Christian, would we have any reason to suspect that there was a problem with suicide here? In the later version, it's a little bit less clear. In this version, it's quite clear, right? And we get a couple references to this explicitly. First of all, let me let's look at what the story says about this. But Turambar, this is now back when he has just naming himself. He's just named himself Turambar because he's seeking death, right? But Turambar was filled with shame and anger, and perchance he had slain himself. So great was his madness. Although thus might he not hope that ever his spirit would be freed from the dark glooms of Mandos, or stray into the pleasant paths of Valinor. But amidst his misery he bethought him of Philivrin's pallid face, and he bowed his head. For the thought came into his heart to seek back through all the woods after her sad footsteps, even be it to Angamandi and the hills of iron. Maybe in that desperate venture he had found a kindly and swift death, or perchance an ill one, and maybe he had rescued Philivrin and found happiness, as there is precedent, of course, for somebody pursuing an orc band with captives and rescuing him successfully. Yet not thus was he fated to earn the name he had taken anew, and the drake reading his mind suffered him not thus lightly to escape his tide of ill. Okay, so two things I would emphasize about this passage. First, the initial and very clear statement that he is, in that moment, in this, again, this is the moment of his right before his horrible choice, when everything seems awful. So great is his madness at the captivity of Philivrin that perchance he had slain himself. Right? He considers suicide in this moment. The narrator says to us explicitly that this is an act of madness. That suicide is an act of madness, right? So great was his madness that perchance he had slain himself. And also spells out for us the spiritual consequences. Although thus might he not hope that ever his spirit would be freed from the dark glooms of Mandos, or stray into the pleasant paths of Valinor. Now, a thing for context, especially for people who weren't here for the Book of Lost Tales 1 class, the fate of men is uncertain. There is not yet, in Tolkien's mythology, a clear sense of the souls of men going we know not whither and escaping the circles of the world. That's not said of men. And indeed the eternal fate, sort of this, the eternal fate of men, it's really unclear. Tolkien, I think the only fair way to describe the Book of Lost Tales version of that is that Tolkien hadn't really thought it through fully yet. But inasmuch, the only things that he does say suggest that men go to the halls of Mandos, but they can, some of them, do find the favor to go to Valinor, to go to the paths of Valinor. And indeed what it sounds is a lot like traditional mythological descriptions of, even like Greek ones, of the portion of the underworld where the unjust are tormented, and the Elysian fields. Though I think the one I'm actually thinking is not Greek, but Roman. I'm thinking the Aeneid in my head right now when I'm describing these things. But anyway, so that seems to be the model that he's kind of using in his mythology here. But howsoever that be, the point is perfectly clear that those who commit suicide can never be free from the dark glooms of Mandos. You're on a one-way ticket to the bad place if you commit suicide. That's perfectly clear in this passage. And the narrator states this, at least with the tone of authority here. Now, then later, so this is like, again, wait, sorry, I didn't do the second half of the passage. So the first half of the passage states that stuff really clearly, but also notice the implications of the second half of the passage, right? But amidst his misery he bethought him of Philivrin's pallid face, and he bowed his head, for the thought came into his heart, right? Rallying against that mad temptation to commit suicide, what he clings to instead is this desperate idea, right? This thought that comes into his heart to seek back through all the woods after her sad footsteps, even be it to Angamandi and the hills of iron, right? No. I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep after them. even if there's no hope, I'm gonna and it's nevertheless I'm gonna do that, and maybe I'll die. Maybe she's already dead, and maybe I will die, but that's how I'm gonna choose to die, right? And the narrator says, "Hey, who knows what might have happened?" Had Turin made that choice, so again, this is right before the choice he made in slide 1 that we were talking about, right? His first impulse is a good one. Seems like later Turin never has good impulses, but his first impulse is a good one, right? I'm going to dedicate my life to following Fylivrin. I'm going to try to rescue her, and if I can't rescue her, I will die seeking her. And the narrator's like, hey, who knows how that would have turned out? Any number of ways that could have turned out. It's true that the majority of the ways that could have turned out were in Turin's death, but hey, he might have found a kindly and swift death, right? Finding death is not just like, being killed in the doorway of her father's house wouldn't have been a bad death either, right? He could at least have found, that Boromir kind of death. Yeah, Yana says instead of a suicide, he contemplates a suicide mission. Exactly, but it's totally different, right? Mm-hmm. Completely different context. It's a heroic death. He would die doing the right thing, right? And the narrator suggests maybe it would have turned out, right? Maybe he had rescued Fylivrin and found happiness. Could be, right? But it didn't happen because it was not thus was he fated to earn the name he had taken anew, and because the dragon has other plans and is about to lay the whammy on him that's going to lead him to make the bad choice. So again, notice this is another reason why even his one major really bad choice here is still like we have the context, like he first made the good choice and was only swayed from that good choice and pushed to the bad choice through the influence and enchantment of the dragon. Anyhow, okay. But look at the end. Then Urin departed, and he would not touch the gold. Well, don't worry about Urin right now. I'm, by the way, deliberately leaving Urin aside now. When we do the chapter on the Naglafring, we'll come back to the Urin material that we get at the end of this story, so I'm not leaving it behind. I also wanted to talk some about the way that dragons are described and a couple other things, but we'll save that too. We're going to come back to those things when we do the Naglafring. So I promise that we won't those really interesting passages where he describes like other species of dragons and stuff like that. We'll definitely talk about that, but I will, but not now. I'll save that. One more. Let's just look at this last, and again, thinking about their suicides. Look at what happens to them after death. So then Urin departed, but would not touch the gold, and stricken in years he reached Hisalome and died among men, but his words living after him bred estrangement between elves and men. Yet it is said that when he was dead, his shade fared into the woods seeking Mavwen, and long those twain haunted the woods about the fall of Silver Bowl, bewailing their children. That's pretty sad. But the elves of Kor have told, and they know, that at last Urin and Mavwen fared to Mondos, and Nianori was not there, nor Turin their son. So Urin and Mavwen's shades, after haunting Silver Bowl for a long time, show up in Mondos, and they're like, hey, where are Nianori and Turin, right? We've thought finally at least we could have like a ghostly family reunion in misery here in Mondos, right? I mean, was that too much to ask? Turambar indeed had followed Nianori along the black pathways to the doors of Fui, but Fui would not open to them, neither would Veifantur. Now, who is this Fui? Well, we'd have to go back to the Book of Lost Tales Part 1 for this. We don't have time. But Fui is the character who will later become Nienna, and who is at first the wife of Veifantur, who is Mendos. And she is the cold goddess of the dead, who is involved in punishing the dead. And Fui is really scary. And they follow the black pathways to the doors of Fui, presumably based on what we were told earlier, because they committed suicide. Karita, exactly. She's the one who makes tears. She's responsible for tears. That's like what she does. She's the tear generator.
Okay, so anyway, so Turin follows Nianori down the black pathway to the doors of Fui, but Fui won't take them, and Veifantur won't take them. So the doors of Mandos are shut against them, though that's supposed to be their destiny if they commit suicide. Yet now the prayers of Urin and Mavwin came even to Manwë, and the gods had mercy on their unhappy fate, so that those twain, Turin and Nianori, entered into Fals Almir, the bath of flame, even as Urwendi and her maidens had done in ages past, before the first rising of the sun. Urwendi is the one who is driving the sun. She's the sun person. And so were all their sorrows and stains washed away, and they dwelt as shining Valar among the blessed ones. And now the love of that brother and sister is very fair. But Turambar indeed shall stand beside Fionwe in the great rack, and Melko and his drakes shall curse the sword of Mormakil. So Manwë listens. They're forgiven. They have to be cleansed first, though. It's not that suicide isn't a big deal, apparently. They still have to be cleansed. The stream was not capable of doing it. It requires fire to cleanse them. But once they are indeed cleansed in the Valar's bath of flame, they're purified, and their sorrows and stains, both, are washed away. And they dwell among the blessed ones. And I love that line, and now the love of that brother and sister is very fair. All of the sweet and beautiful elements, those sweet and beautiful elements which, placed in the terrible circumstances of their lives, were the center of such horror in their earlier story, now are merely lovely. And they know one another, and they love one another, and are cleansed of both stain and sorrow. And we're given a glimpse of the fact that he is going, after this redemption here, he is going to play a crucial role. It's kind of it's only implied here, right? Melko and his drakes shall curse the sword of Mormakil. But the idea here seems to be that Turin is going to get some payback. And indeed, in later versions of the story, but not nearly so late as the Narn or the Silmarillion, in like the early 1930s, like 1930 to 1933, in the version of the stories that Tolkien writes then, he explicitly says that in the Battle of Battles, in the Dagor Dagorath, the last battle at the end of the world, Melko is finally killed, and it's Turin who kills him with his black sword. That reference, when Tolkien makes it in the context of the 1930 Quenta, seems to come completely out of freaking nowhere. I mean, it seems to be, when he says it, it's like, whoa, like, random, Turin comes back, didn't see that one coming. It makes a lot more sense in the context of this passage, and, in this story itself, it makes a lot more sense, given, thinking about, coming back to the question that we were asking at the beginning, right? Why is this a favorite story among men? I don't think that it's only this ending. It's only the redemption here at the end that makes it a favorite story. But I think that the redemption here kind of resonates with one of the things we were looking at before. Why is this a favorite story? This seems to be a story which really captures the human condition. Now, that's a terrible... people might think that's a terrible and pessimistic thing to say about the human condition. But nevertheless, it really captures a lot. And yet, it ends in redemption and cleansing. And even in a sense, restitution. Turin, who is deprived of happiness through the misfortune of his whole life, is given happiness, and the love of that brother and sister is very fair. Turin, who could never find love, and every time he did find love, lost it, in terrible, awful ways, now has it forever, right? And is as a shining Valar among the blessed ones, and moreover is made by the Valar into an instrument to throw down Melko and his drakes, right? So Glorund and Melko, in the end, it's Turin, and by extension, mankind as a whole, who have the last laugh here. Don Standing asks a wonderful question. Is this why Turin is called Elf-Friend in the Fellowship? Wonderful question, Don. The question obviously is, when Tolkien wrote that, how would he have thought of Turin? What would the name Turin have evoked in Tolkien's own mind at the time that he wrote the Council of Elrond? And I think it wouldn't be that far from this. I mean, it's far from this. Like, chronologically, it's like 20 years later that he's writing the Council of Elrond. But he's less than 5 years removed. Well, he's within a decade anyway of the version in which Turin is still the one who's killing Melkor who's killing Morgoth at the end of the world. So that rates. I mean, like, okay, Turin during his life might have screwed everything up for almost every elf he ever came in contact with, but, at the end of the day, there are prophecies in existence that say that Turin is gonna actually be on the winning side here when push comes to shove. Was that something that was in Elrond's mind? Maybe. I like that idea, Don. And Karita was just saying that too. I like that idea. I couldn't prove that that's what was in his mind at that point, Don. But I liked it. It certainly makes more sense than anything else I can think of. There's very little in the Turin story, certainly in the later Turin story, that would seem to justify Elrond's comments. But the Council of Elrond is written significantly before the later Turin story. The revision, these major revisions to the Turin story, the later Narn, which Christopher Tolkien publishes in Unfinished Tales, is written like during the Fellowship of the Ring period, like during the Lord of the Rings period, like during the publication period of the Lord of the Rings. It's written after he wrote the Lord of the Rings. So, yeah, I like that. Okay, I'm going to let you guys go now, finally, after keeping you late tonight. But as I say, I do have some things that I want to talk about dragons and stuff, but I'll save that for a few classes from now. Next time, we're going to talk about the fall of Gondolin. I'm excited to talk about the fall of Gondolin next time. More terrible tragedy and destruction to come in Gondolin next time. But there too we're going to see a version of the story which is quite different from later versions. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So, see you for Gondolin next week. Thanks for joining me, everybody, and have a good week. Talk to you next week. Bye now.